What would you do if the man you loved, once surrounded by contracts, meetings, and polished offices, stood in a field of dry grass with a hoe in his hand and admitted without saying the words directly that he was trying to build a new life before the old one completely collapsed? The afternoon sun fell over the empty plot like a final blessing on something that had already been lost. CEO Jack, his shirt wrinkled and damp with sweat, stood in front of a patch of land he had just cleared with his own hands. Around him, the dry weeds lay flattened, the smell of fresh-cut grass rising from the ground. Not long ago, he had been a man whose days were measured in phone calls, bank deadlines, and business signatures. But now he was standing under the open sky, gripping a hoe as if manual labor itself might keep despair from swallowing him whole. Beside him, Tu Tien said nothing. She did not need to. He looked at the land, then at her, and told her she could raise whatever chickens and pigs she wanted there. On the surface, it sounded practical, almost ordinary, but underneath it was the trembling beginning of something far more desperate and far more beautiful. Two people trying to build shelter with their own hands, while the financial storm closing in around them threatened to destroy everything else. The first sign of that new life was not confidence. It was exhaustion. Jack straightened his back slowly after clearing the weeds, every muscle protesting the unfamiliar strain. Sweat clung to his forehead, ran down his neck, soaked into the collar of his shirt. His hands, once more accustomed to papers and pens than tools and rough wood, were red from gripping the hoe. Yet inside that physical fatigue, something unexpected flickered, a small, fragile hope. The kind that does not arrive with certainty, but with the quiet suggestion that survival might still be possible if pride can be laid down and work can begin. Tu Tien stood a few steps away, watching him carefully. She did not rush forward with pity. She did not turn the moment into something sentimental. She simply stood there with that steady softness she carried everywhere. And when he spoke, when he said she could build, raise animals, do whatever she needed to do on that land, she answered, with only a small nod. But that nod carried the weight of partnership. It said she understood what he was trying to do. It said she knew this was not only about chickens or pigs or a patch of rural soil. It was about finding a place where breath could return to two people who had almost been crushed under a life that had become too expensive to hold. The breeze moved across the field then, carrying the scent of damp earth and freshly cut weeds. It was the smell of labor, of beginning again from the level of the ground. Jack breathed it in and, for a moment, allowed himself to imagine that maybe this simple countryside life so far from balance sheets, boardrooms, and red figures on financial reports could become a temporary refuge. Not a final answer, not a miracle, but a place to stand while everything else shook. By noon, they were working side by side. The sun had grown harsh, flattening the shadows and forcing heat into everything. The wood they had gathered lay stacked near the fence line. Old iron mesh leaned against bamboo poles. Jack knelt over a rough frame, hammer in hand, trying to fasten one plank to another with more determination than skill. His hands trembled slightly from effort. Every nail he drove into the wood seemed to resist him at first, as though even the simplest work was asking whether he truly meant to trade the world he had known for this one. Tu Tien moved more naturally. She passed him what he needed without making him feel clumsy. She adjusted the boards, held the mesh in place, pointed quietly to where the frame should be reinforced. The two of them spoke only in small, practical phrases, but what grew between those phrases was more meaningful than conversation. Their silence was not empty. It was full of concentration, trust, and the shared understanding that this small structure they were building was not just an animal pen. It was dignity rebuilt in rough materials. It was the beginning of a life made from labor instead of illusion. The hammer strikes echoed across the yard with a steady rhythm. Jack began to feel something strange beneath the ache in his shoulders and the sweat on his skin. This work was humiliating in one sense, because it forced him to face how far he had fallen from the life people associated with a man like him. But it was also healing in another. No negotiation was hidden here. No false promise. No polite smile masking danger. Wood was wood. Iron was iron. Sweat meant effort. A structure rose because two people chose to keep building it. Now and then, Jack glanced at Tu Tien while she worked. He watched the easy steadiness of her movements, the way she wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist and kept going, the way her face did not dramatize hardship, but simply absorbed it into action. Something in him softened every time he looked at her. She was not merely helping him with a chicken coop and pig pen. She was standing inside his collapse without stepping away from him. And in that truth, there was a warmth strong enough to survive even the fear he was still carrying. By evening, the rough shapes of the pens had started to appear. They were uneven, simple, far from beautiful, but they stood. Jack touched one of the wooden posts with a kind of quiet disbelief. He had spent the whole day making something with his own body, instead of issuing instructions to other people. It was not glamorous. It would never impress anyone, but it was real, and sometimes real things matter more than admired ones. That night, he came back carrying bags of livestock feed and stacked them in the corner of the house. The gesture was small, almost practical to the point of dullness, yet emotionally it mattered. It meant he was committing to the idea. He was not just letting Tu Tien dream aloud about raising chickens and pigs. He was putting money, time, and tired hands behind the vision. The bags sat there like a quiet promise. This difficult new road was not an idle fantasy anymore, but the next morning made clear how divided his life had become. Before the dew had fully lifted from the grass, Jack put on his familiar suit again. The contrast was almost painful. The same man who had spent the previous day hammering planks under the sun now stood, straightening a collar and buttoning a shirt, as if he still belonged entirely to the world of polished offices and corporate control. Yet the fit was no longer clean in spirit, even if it remained neat in appearance. He had left some part of himself in the field already. Tu Tien, meanwhile, prepared her basket and stepped onto the village path toward the orchard and then the market. The morning around her was simple and clear. Roosters called in the distance. A faint ribbon of smoke rose from a nearby kitchen. Dew clung to leaves and flashed silver when the light hit it. She bent to pick fruit with patient hands, moving through the orchard as though she had always belonged to mornings like this. Each ripe fruit she placed into the basket was another small contribution to the fragile life they were trying to hold together. Their paths that day could not have been more different. Jack drove back toward the company with anxiety sitting heavily in his chest, while Tu Tien followed the village road with a basket on her arm and work waiting under open sky. Yet both were moving toward the same purpose, keeping their life from collapsing. That shared purpose tied together two worlds that otherwise seemed impossible to reconcile. In the car, Jack's fear returned in full. It sat beside him like a passenger he could not force out. The fields passed green and calm beyond the window, but he hardly saw them. His mind was elsewhere: calls from the bank, overdue debts, missed deadlines, the terrible possibility of bankruptcy hardening from fear into fact. Even his smile at the office doors felt artificial now. Meetings came and went. Employees greeted him respectfully. Papers were placed before him. Questions waited to be answered. Yet underneath every surface act, the same panic remained. What if this is already too late? What if the little pens rising behind that small house are not a beginning but only a poor disguise for collapse? He gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His breathing shortened. At times he felt almost divided into two men. One was the Jack the company still expected: steady, competent, decisive, impossible to shake. The other was a man standing in a dusty yard trying to build a chicken coop before the debts buried him alive. The countryside morning he had just left seemed to belong to another version of life, one so peaceful it was almost unbearable to remember while entering the machinery of financial pressure again. And still, as the hours dragged on, he carried one image with him like a private defense against despair. Tu Tien, in the orchard, gathering fruit under the early light. That image returned to him again and again through the day, as if some part of him knew that if he lost sight of her steady labor, he might lose sight of himself as well. She had not asked for grand reassurances. She had not demanded rescue. She had simply picked up her basket and gone to work. There was something humbling in that, something almost sacred. When Jack returned in the late afternoon, the countryside light had turned warmer. Long shadows lay across the ground. The unfinished pens stood waiting. Tu Tien was already there, ready to continue. He stepped back into the labor almost immediately, as though he needed it to wash off the company's air. Together they raised more of the frame, tied mesh into place, reinforced the corners. Bamboo, wood, iron, simple materials taking shape under tired hands, yet the fear had not left him. It clung to the edges of his face. Tu Tien noticed it in the way his eyes drifted away sometimes, while his hands still moved. She noticed it in the heaviness of his shoulders, in the way he occasionally paused and then resumed with more force than necessary, as though physical effort might hammer panic into silence. The breeze that came through the field smelled of earth and livestock and evening, but it could not fully lift the dark cloud still resting over him. Even so, he kept working. There was something noble and heartbreaking in that persistence. Each movement suggested a man who had decided that even if he could not conquer fear, he would at least refuse to sit still beneath it. Tu Tien stayed close, offering small, practical help and the even greater comfort of simple presence. She did not ask him to explain the weight in his mind. She understood enough already. Sometimes love does its deepest work not by speaking, but by remaining. When they finally paused, Tu Tien reached into the fold of her clothing and took out the money she had earned from selling fruit. She held it out to him quietly. Her voice was gentle, but there was nothing weak about it. She told him to use it for the business. Jack stared at the money as if it were far heavier than the amount it represented. His first instinct was immediate refusal. He shook his head, pushed her hand away slightly, said he would manage. Pride rose in him, but not the selfish kind. It was the pride of a man who could barely bear the thought of the woman he loved having to shoulder what he believed should have remained his burden. His voice trembled when he tried to refuse her, because deep down, he already knew refusal was no longer only about pride. It was also about fear. Accepting the money would mean accepting fully that he was not carrying this alone anymore, that the life they were trying to save no longer belonged to him as protector and her as beneficiary, but to both of them equally. Tu Tien did not withdraw her hand. She looked at him steadily, directly, and said in her own simple way what needed to be said. This was how they would get through it together. Those words entered him more deeply than any grand speech could have. For a long moment, Jack said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded and took the money. The gesture was small, but emotionally it changed the whole space around them. A warmth spread through him that felt almost painful because of how long he had been cold with fear. It was not the relief of problems solved. It was the relief of no longer standing alone under them. In that money, there was more than market earnings. There was faith, sacrifice, trust, love translated into something useful. Jack lowered his head for a second, overcome by a gratitude too large for language. The expression on his face softened in a way it had not all day. The worry remained. The bankruptcy threat had not vanished, but something essential had shifted. Despair had lost its monopoly over him. By nightfall, a small fire burned outside. Its light flickered over the yard, over the half-finished pens, over the two of them sitting close in the quiet. The house behind them was simple, the future ahead still uncertain, the financial storm still unresolved. And yet, that night carried a peace that had not existed in weeks. Not because circumstances had changed dramatically, but because their bond had revealed its strength in the open. The fire cracked softly, smoke drifted upward. They spoke only a little about the work they had finished, about what still needed doing tomorrow, about feed, fencing, fruit, errands. But beneath those practical exchanges lived something deeper. The simple truth that the day, for all its fear and exhaustion, had ended with both of them still here, still trying, still choosing each other in the middle of the strain. Jack looked at Tu Tien across the firelight and let a rare smile reach him. It was not the smile of a man free from danger. It was the smile of someone who had remembered, in the middle of collapse, what companionship feels like. He saw in her not only tenderness but courage, not only devotion but quiet strength. She had picked fruit, gone to market, worked beside him, offered what little she had, sat with him now in the half-light, not demanding that he pretend to be unworried, only refusing to leave while he was. And Tu Tien, too, had changed a little that day. She had seen Jack in a form few people associated with him. Not the CEO in command, but the man beneath the title, sweating in a wrinkled shirt, gripping tools awkwardly, fighting panic, accepting help reluctantly, and still trying to build something real with his own hands. The sight had not diminished him in her eyes. It had made him dearer, more human, more hers. The fire slowly burned lower. The night grew deeper around them. Somewhere beyond the yard, the countryside settled into its own soft silence. And as Jack exhaled and looked into the last rising sparks, he understood something that no meeting, bank call, or profit chart had been able to teach him. The future was still frightening. Bankruptcy was still a possibility. The company might still fall. But the presence of one faithful heart beside him had already changed the meaning of those fears. In the end, this story is not really about a pig pen, a chicken coop, or even money. It is about the moment two people stop waiting for life to become easy before they begin truly building it together. It is about a man discovering that love is not weakened when it accepts help, but strengthened. It is about a woman whose small earnings carry more hope than all the numbers haunting a boardroom. It is about sweat, soil, bamboo, firelight, and the humble courage of continuing when nothing is guaranteed. And maybe that is the emotional truth this story leaves behind. Love is not proven only in dramatic rescue or public vows. Sometimes it is proven in a basket of fruit, in an outstretched hand offering the last of one's earnings, in a half-finished pen built from scrap wood, in the choice to keep working under a sky that offers no promises. Jack's fear that day was real. So was Tu Tien's quiet faith. And if there was hope at the end of it, it was not because the future had suddenly become safe. It was because, for the first time in a long time, the burden of surviving it no longer belonged to one person alone.